profound hush fell over the room as diplomats representing 3 continents held their breath in collective anticipation. He had not raised his voice or resorted to threats of any kind. Instead, he had merely laid a single sheet of paper upon the polished wood and quietly declared that this was how it would end. Not a single person in that room moved. None of them dared to. As you and I prepare to dissect this extraordinary sequence of events, tracing a quiet coup that took place behind closed doors, we find that the entire chain of events actually had its beginning on April 9, 2026, in the deep pre-dawn shadows of the Apostolic Palace, while the city of Rome was still enveloped in a cool, undisturbed silence. In the hours before dawn, the cobblestone streets surrounding the Vatican stood entirely deserted, occupied only by a few Swiss guards on patrol. These sentries moved with the deliberate, disciplined calm of men who understood that true vigilance is born from absolute stillness. Deep within the ancient palace walls, where centuries of fallen empires and shifting global orders lay recorded, Robert Francis Provost sat in complete solitude. Now known to the world as Pope Leo XIV, the pontiff studied a file of sensitive documents compiled over the last 3 months under the dim amber glow of a desk lamp. Sleep had eluded him once again, a persistent condition that had become his shadow in recent weeks as the pressure continued to mount. An unrelenting weight from global events pressed constantly against the pontiff, though it did not manifest with the theatrical drama of a Hollywood film. Instead, it was a persistent ache behind his eyes that remained through his daily prayers, his grueling meetings, and the solitary meals he took in silence. Just 2 days prior, the conflict, widely labeled as the Iran War, had reached a fragile ceasefire. While world capitals celebrated and the Vatican released a statement praising it as a sign of hope, Leo XIV remained deeply skeptical. He had sanctioned the official wording, yet he felt no real relief, only a cold, historical awareness of how often such truces simply precede more bloodshed. There was no escaping the reality that this newly brokered peace was dangerously unstable, a truth known to every intelligent observer in the intelligence community. The animosity between the warring factions ran too deep, their historical grievances were too ancient, and the domestic political pressures facing each leader were too immediate and unforgiving. To make matters worse, the day before, President Donald Trump had posted a fierce critique on social media. He openly accused the Pope of suffering from a delusion of omnipotence after the pontiff suggested in a Sunday address that the international arms trade was driving the war. That highly critical post had already gone viral across the globe. Throughout the following day, a succession of concerned cardinals gained audience with Leo XIV, each urging him to issue an official rebuttal. One advisor insisted that the very dignity of the papacy was at stake, while another presented a meticulously worded draft statement. Though diplomatic, this proposed response made the Vatican's deep displeasure with the American president's rhetoric abundantly clear. The Pope read the document in silence, staring at the page before setting it aside. He calmly looked up and said simply, "We respond with what we do, not with what we say." The frustrated cardinal withdrew, carrying that unique blend of irritation and grudging respect the Pope so easily commanded. Behind the public drama, a secret operation was already unfolding that no cardinal, press officer, or Vatican correspondent could have possibly foreseen. 4 days prior, the Pope had initiated this meeting through a shadow network of contacts, bypassing standard communications. He utilized trusted intermediaries, retired diplomats, influential priests in crucial embassies, and a former Latin American head of state who had known Provost since the 1990s. The quiet call went out across the globe, landing on the desks of 11 carefully selected individuals spread across 4 continents. It was delivered not as an official command from the Holy See, but as a confidential, highly exclusive invitation to a historic gathering. This entire encounter was designed to be quiet and calculatedly modest, signaling to all participants that this was a serious negotiation rather than political theater. The chosen venue was a small, obscure conference room on the 2nd floor of the Apostolic Palace, purposefully selected to avoid the grand halls where media cameras usually capture history. The room featured plain walls, a dark wooden oval table with high-backed chairs, a lone crucifix, and windows overlooking the Vatican gardens where early April roses were beginning to bloom. This is where Leo XIV would present a document that had taken 11 people 3 months of exhaustive secrecy to draft, a document never once mentioned in any official Vatican committee. No mention of this project had ever leaked into a press briefing, nor did it possess an official name, though the Secretariat of State internally called it the Initiative. This was the only formal Vatican office trusted with its existence. The team responsible for constructing it was remarkably small and diverse, consisting of highly specialized minds. Among them was a retired United Nations mediator who had successfully negotiated ceasefires in 3 separate African wars, a man who famously wrote that peace fails from a lack of imagination. Joining him were 2 former Latin American presidents who maintained strong personal ties with key leaders on all sides of the escalating conflict in Iran. The Brain Trust also featured a prominent moral theologian who had dedicated 20 years to constructing a modern ethical framework for warfare, respected equally by military commanders and human rights advocates. Beside him sat a seasoned canon lawyer with 15 years of experience in active war zones, a man who understood firsthand why fragile peace treaties succeed or crumble. Then there was the Pope himself, who spent 3 months asking the most difficult questions of the group. He repeatedly refused to water down the text to appease global powers, recalling his own words from an early meeting when he stated, "If it doesn't ask anything difficult of them, it isn't asking anything at all. If you and I examine the mechanics of this plan, we see it was far from a traditional treaty. Standard treaties demanded state approval, sluggish legislatures, and political coalitions, which inevitably dragged out negotiations for years, while innocent people died in the trenches. This initiative bypassed that entirely by proposing a rapid set of binding, verifiable agreements focused on 3 critical areas. These included protecting civilian populations, granting unrestricted access to humanitarian aid, and establishing a secure, permanent back-channel communication line. Remarkably, this system was not guaranteed by world governments, but by civil networks operating under the immense moral authority of the Holy See. Spanning 6 pages and comprised of exactly 112 precise provisions, this blueprint tied every single clause to a concrete deadline and an independent verification system. There were no vague platitudes or empty aspirations within these pages. The entire document had been relentlessly stress-tested against 17 failed international peace efforts from recent history, analyzing exactly where those previous diplomatic missions had collapsed and why. Leo XIV personally reviewed the final copy 7 times, dissecting every word. With each pass, the pontiff found minor flaws to correct, ensuring the final text was as ironclad as humanly possible before presenting it. With every revision, the Pope felt a quiet, profound sense of realism, rather than naive optimism. He knew this text was crafted by experts who recognized the limits of diplomacy but refused to stand by, knowing that inaction is a choice with its own devastating consequences. Early on the morning of April 11th, he entered the quiet conference room 10 minutes ahead of schedule. After placing a copy of the proposal at every seat, he sat down, folded his hands, and waited in total silence. Over the next 15 minutes, the back-channel envoys and seasoned negotiators arrived in small groups, men who had spent their entire careers operating in the gray areas between official policy and actual reality. A tense, polite nodding was exchanged among the attendees, who recognized each other as veteran adversaries on the global stage. As they found their seats, several diplomats silently noted the complete lack of grandeur in the room, realizing with surprise that this was no media stunt. There were no cameras, no microphones, and no audience. Once everyone was settled, Leo XIV slowly scanned the table, locking eyes with each individual before speaking a single number. 412,000. He paused to let the devastating figure sink into the silence. That is the estimated number of civilians who have been displaced in the conflict zones we are discussing since January of this year. These are not soldiers or active military personnel, but innocent families and children who were attending school just 6 months ago, the Pope continued. He reminded them that 412,000 individuals were displaced directly by the choices of the very institutions sitting in that room. A heavy silence descended on the diplomats. "I did not invite you here to give a speech," the pontiff explained. "I have given speeches. You have read them. They have not been sufficient, and I am aware of that. I invited you here because I believe each person in this room, regardless of the public position your government has taken, possesses the capacity to act." Our investigation reveals the true scope of Pope Leo XIV's secret diplomacy. He was not seeking to solve every global crisis or rewrite history. His focus was entirely on concrete, verifiable actions to be executed over the next 30 days, aiming to ease the suffering of 412,000 desperate people. Pointing to the document, he made his intentions clear. This was a proposal, not an ultimatum from the Holy See. It was a framework forged by seasoned operators in back-channel rooms where real decisions are made, away from the cameras. He urged them to read it and defend its merits, not for his sake, but for those who had no voice to speak for themselves. Behind closed doors, a grueling 4-hour debate unfolded, a confrontation that none of the diplomatic participants would ever fully disclose to the public. However, our investigation has reconstructed the scene through confidential letters and the private accounts of 2 insiders. The atmosphere inside that room was thick with tension. 3 of the envoys arrived with highly coordinated pre-packaged objections spanning legal, technical, and political fault lines. One diplomat consumed nearly an hour arguing that without binding international arbitration, the entire peace framework would be useless in practice. Still, another raised warnings about setting a dangerous diplomatic precedent. "We must consider the high stakes of this meeting, which threaten to redefine the delicate balance between church and state if the Vatican were caught bypassing official government channels." Yet, Pope Leo XIV listened to every single protest without once cutting anyone off. He did not wave away their anxieties. When he did speak, he pointed directly to specific clauses that addressed their fears, while candidly admitting where the text fell short. He was not merely defending a fixed position or playing political games. In a rare display of genuine diplomacy, he was actively trying to solve a crisis alongside the very people sitting in front of him. During the negotiations, a seasoned diplomat with 30 years of experience, a veteran of 3 of the most brutal conflicts of the last generation, set down his papers and confronted the pontiff directly. He asked how the Vatican could possibly expect the actual warring factions to accept such a framework. A heavy silence blanketed the room. After a quiet pause, Leo XIV responded, explaining that he was not asking the ruling powers to agree to anything just yet. Instead, he was asking the envoys themselves. He knew those in power were not evil, but simply exhausted, terrified, and worn down by the endless cycle of violence. These leaders are trapped by advisors who benefit directly from keeping the war alive, meaning they will never make the first move. They cannot risk looking weak, but they will adapt if they realize the geopolitical dynamics have changed. The Pope made it clear that his goal was not an immediate end to the war, but a fundamental shift in that dynamic. The tense meeting concluded without any signatures, official pacts, or press releases. The diplomats slipped out of a side exit, disappearing back into the chaotic Roman traffic. Yet, behind the scenes, the Vatican team began tracking subtle movements that suggested something real was starting to take shape. A flurry of secret phone calls and carefully coordinated meetings soon began to yield results. On the morning of April 12th, a breakthrough occurred. A humanitarian corridor, which had been rejected during 4 previous rounds of public peace talks, was suddenly approved through back-channel negotiations. The 2 warring factions, previously thought to be completely irreconcilable, had reached a silent consensus. There was no public fanfare, no press release, and no mention of the Pope. Deep within the Apostolic Palace, Leo XIV welcomed the report with a quiet nod, paused in reflection, and then turned his attention back to the urgent paperwork before him. An eyewitness in the room later remarked that the Pope did not look satisfied, but rather deeply resolved. like a man who had completed a single step on an incredibly long path. What almost no one in the Roman Curia realized at the time was that this humanitarian corridor was only a catalyst, not the final destination. The secret initiative was constructed in highly strategic layers, each designed to build unstoppable momentum for the next phase. This first corridor was merely Layer 1, the most modest, immediate, and politically feasible concession outlined in the entire master plan. Our investigation reveals that this first step was positioned at the very front of the proposal on purpose, purely because it was highly achievable. Even a modest, unglamorous victory has the power to change the mindset of cynics who insist that peace is impossible. Pope Leo XIV possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of human psychology and institutional inertia. Having spent 30 years deep inside the labyrinth of the global church hierarchy, he knew exactly how to sway stubborn bureaucrats. He recognized that moral lectures and intellectual arguments rarely work. The true key to breaking a diplomatic deadlock is establishing a concrete, undeniable precedent. The reality of an impossible goal being achieved shifted the entire diplomatic terrain. Over the next 7 days, the pontiff convened 2 secret strategy sessions with his core team. The initial meeting was a rapid 40-minute debriefing, focusing strictly on resolving outstanding disputes from the first phase. The subsequent session dragged on for 2 hours, hammering out the highly sensitive second layer of the framework. This layer dealt with the protection of civilians in war-torn territories, the exact point where raw national interest would collide with public rhetoric. The Pope harbored no illusions about the intense opposition they were about to face. His perspective had been forged by 3 years of grueling missionary work in the isolated highlands of Peru, teaching him a harsh lesson in political realism rather than cheap cynicism. He had watched countless communities receive grand promises, only to see those vows delayed, watered down, or completely abandoned. Through this experience, he developed a rare ability to distinguish between empty rhetoric pressured by the media and genuine, lasting commitments. He understood that once the public pressure fades, the real struggle begins. His current initiative was not a magic cure, but rather a blueprint designed to foster accountability, patience, and steady follow-through. This newly designed diplomatic structure was engineered to make compliance attractive and betrayal costly. By leveraging the moral weight of international civil society and the Vatican itself, the framework ensured that public defection would carry a devastating reputational price. Of course, the Pope was fully aware that this mechanism alone was not a complete cure. In the tragic arena of human suffering, no single effort is ever truly sufficient. Pain and conflict possess their own dark momentum, regenerating far quicker than any humanitarian aid can heal. Yet, despite these grim realities, this framework represented a vital, undeniable starting point. When serious actors commit themselves to a serious mission, the effort has a tendency to take on a life of its own, redrawing the boundaries of what is possible. Overcoming hopelessness is always the most grueling phase of any real transformation. Unsurprisingly, rumors of this covert operation began to leak through the ancient, whisper-filled corridors of Rome. The vast, informal network of intelligence sources and diplomats that feeds the international press began to buzz. In Brussels, an investigative reporter picked up the trail. A former United Nations official secretly described the Vatican proposal as a formidable document with real teeth, rather than empty rhetoric. Less than 48 hours after the historic corridor deal was struck, 2 key negotiators from the initial Vatican meeting quietly made contact. Bypassing formal diplomatic protocols, they reached out directly to the Pope's strategy team through the very same back-channel routes that had originally brought them to Rome. The content of their messages was brief and guarded. One envoy inquired about a specific technical detail in the treaty, while the other requested an off-the-record discussion regarding the timeline for the next phase. While these looked like routine administrative queries on the surface, they were recognized as major breakthroughs. These secret messages were undeniably tactical signals. They proved that the envoys who had entered the Apostolic Palace on the morning of April 11th believing they were merely showing polite deference to the Pope, had left with a completely altered perspective. Something vital had shifted inside that simple meeting room overlooking the Vatican gardens. Now, you and I can see how a cynical world, scarred by years of empty political promises and useless ceasefire declarations, was finally starting to pay attention. Reluctantly, and with the deep caution of those who have been betrayed before, global leaders were starting to listen to a quiet voice of hope. If we look closer at these events, a striking pattern emerges. We must analyze, with the utmost caution, the distinct possibility that the proceedings unfolding in Rome were far more than mere theater. Inside those walls, the man clad in white sat in his quiet chambers, surrounded by a mountain of confidential files. He refused to perform for the cameras, showing neither forced optimism nor defeatist despair. Instead, the evidence suggests he was dealing with something undeniably tangible. This was no sudden miracle or decree of authority. Rather, it was the culmination of exhaustive, grinding work. Someone had finally built a bridge of hard facts, placing it squarely on a table in front of those who still hold the power of decision. Long before his rise to prominence, Robert Francis Prevost learned a vital truth on the streets of Lima. Roads never build themselves. They are carved out by those who decide that reaching a destination is worth every ounce of effort, cost, and terrifying uncertainty. Today, that newly forged road lies before us. It remains narrow and untested, yet its existence is undeniable. This investigation reveals the power of quiet determination and meticulous effort. If this story of hidden struggle resonated with you, please subscribe, leave a like, and share this broadcast with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us bring these vital truths to light. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in our next investigation.